All right, we might get moving. Thank you, everyone, for coming along to this second ACAN Australia talk, the story of architects in a changing climate. Um, my name's Dr. Peter Raisbeck. I'm Principal Honorary Fellow at the Melbourne School of Design and I think co-convener of ACAN Australia. Liz will talk. I'll introduce her in a moment, but we'll also have Hannah Holman, who will be I think fielding questions and posting links into the chat as required. Firstly, we acknowledge the Jagara people and the Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of Meanjin in Brisbane, which is where Liz is. And I also acknowledge the traditional owners, the custodians of Naarm, of the unceded land on which we work, live and learn and live in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri, Wurrung, Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, where both Hannah and myself are this time round. And no doubt there are other First Nations, people working on First Nation countries here as well. We recognise the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the original owners and custodians of the lands and waterways across the Australian continent, with histories of continuous connection dating back more than 60,000 years. We also acknowledge their enduring cultural practices of caring for country. We pay respect to their elders, past, present, and future, and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in climate action. ACAN Australia is a volunteer-driven non-profit organisation committed to tackling the climate and ecological crisis by transforming the built environment. Its purpose is to drive systemic change in architecture, construction, and urban planning to influence policy, industry, and public awareness by advocating for radical change. So, Liz, thank you for coming along again. I hope the last talk was great. Liz is a senior lecturer at UQ School of Architecture, Design and Planning. Through her research, she is exploring ways to advance climate action in architecture with a focus on education. Liz is focused on the targeted investment in university and professional education in the architectural profession to accelerate sustainability transitions in the built environment. This is the second part of her series about how climate action activism is reshaping how architects are educated, how the profession, both here and elsewhere, is responding, and what architecture can contribute to a changing climate. And this was part of her Churchill Fellowship completed in late 2023. This one's going to be more interesting, this talk. Well, not more, I shouldn't say that. What am I saying? This one's going to be maybe more controversial than the last one because this second talk examines how climate action in architecture across the UK and Europe evolved from collective action focused on education. But then that movement began to challenge the structural and cultural conditions of the profession itself. So we will be finishing this time round with a Q&A session, and we're hoping this will be done in a respectful but frank discussion. Probably the best thing to do would be to put questions into the chat and then we'll field them. Hannah and I will field them. And the session, overarching question for this session is, are architects authentically challenging their own profession? And what changes do we need to make to our culture in order to be more effective in terms of working towards carbon mitigation? So thank you so much, Liz. I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks once again, and also to others in ACAN Australia for generously hosting these talks. A special thanks to Hannah Holman and Lucy Humphrey for the support in the lead up to both of these nights. Okay, so to get started, hello to everyone online and also those who might be watching the recording later. I'm really encouraged to see that people are interested enough in the story of architects in a changing climate to join tonight for Chapter 2. If you did miss Chapter 1, the recording's on YouTube, so this Chapter 2 recording will also be uploaded. I do need to once again acknowledge and thank the Churchill Australia Trust for the A.V. Jennings sponsored fellowship which made this project possible. So as mentioned in the last talk, this story is inspired from the learning I gained during that travel fellowship, which included about 36 interviews over 6 weeks and across 5 countries. I spoke with people who were leading climate activism in collective action groups, including students, graduate workers, architects, and academics. And I also interviewed leads of research projects in universities and representatives from industry bodies in architecture. If you do want to read the full report, it can be found on the Churchill Trust Australia website. Now to the story. So this is a 5-year story about architects in a changing climate. And in Chapter 1, I described that 5-year window from 2019 to 2023 in which global climate strikes took hold as a collective action movement in the architectural profession. Especially in the UK, this resulted in reforms to education and training, which is fundamentally reshaping the profession. And tonight I'm going to be closing Chapter 2. But this story doesn't end with Chapter 2. It continues to unfold all around us, and the connections and threads that I trace have already woven their way across the profession and the world. If you aren't familiar with the Churchill Fellowships, they provide funding for international travel for about 4 to 8 weeks so that people can conduct research into innovative practices, skills, or knowledge. The project must be more than a personal passion project or a professional development exercise, and applicants need to demonstrate how that project will benefit the Australian community in some way. So the purpose of this was to bring information back about climate action in architecture education and also extending into professional development to help connect Australian architects and academics with those global trends. I could see that climate action was taking hold in the profession in the UK and across Europe, but that momentum in Australia was comparatively slow and fragmented. In a national survey of the architecture education profession, 82% reported that they felt obstructed when changing practice in response to climate change. I wanted to understand the conditions that were enabling progress internationally and perhaps discover pathways through or around those barriers that the architects were experiencing here. So while this story focuses on the architectural profession all the way on the other side of the world, tonight I'm going to be connecting those events back to an Australian context. My main hope is to generate questions, perhaps some new insights about how connecting to the international climate action movement could strengthen the Australian architectural profession. Tonight's webinar will have 3 parts. First, I'll close Chapter 2 of the story of architects in a changing climate. And then I'll pull together the narrative threads as lessons learned and question how we could connect up these initiatives here in Australia. Finally, we'll stop the recording so that we can speak freely and have an informal Q&A discussion. The characters from Chapter 1 will follow through and be developed, and throughout the talk I'll cast back and forward in time around pivotal moments like all good stories do, to flesh out the details of the events that unfolded in that 5-year period. The catalyst in Chapter 1 was a youth-led climate action movement which grew as millions marched in thousands of school strikes around the world, inspired by Greta Thunberg throughout 2019. For architects, climate action took hold during the 2019 April Rebellion, in which a series of coordinated protests were staged across London by the Extinction Rebellion. Waterloo Bridge in London was occupied continuously, and it was here that the Architects' Climate Action Network, ACAN, was formed. By the time COVID hit in 2020, climate activism in this part of the world did not slow down. In fact, the lockdowns consolidated online networks and accelerated climate action. The social isolation of lockdowns generated a strong appetite for online calls and connection, especially in those early months of the pandemic. The result was a sustained focus on architecture education through collective action. The Anthropocene Architecture School and ACAN formed around those Waterloo Bridge protests in London, and this was shortly followed by Architects Declare. The Royal Institute of British Architects, the RIBA, followed in declaring a climate emergency, and they backed collective action group efforts to reform education. The Royal Institute of British Architects followed with a Architects Declare declaration, and they adopted the climate framework as a knowledge schedule and a mandatory competency area in their education framework. They also supported the mapping of skills in architecture schools against that knowledge schedule in collaboration with architecture schools across the UK. The EU co-funded the Arc for Change project across 5 European universities, and the Irish government was supporting all schools of architecture in Ireland to co-review their curricula with climate change in mind. In parallel, the UK Architects Registration Board initiated a review of architects' initial education and training, in which it established this widespread consensus that modernisation was required. But coming out of COVID in 2021, education surveys showed that many students were not happy with their education, in particular, access to and quality of the practical training that was required for professional registration. And this gave rise to the Future Architects Front. So I attempted to end chapter 1 on a bit of a cliffhanger with this youth-led protest movement that was spearheaded by the Future Architects Front. It united students and graduate workers who were determined to bring about change to the profession. And to do this, they staged a presidential takeover of the RIBA. And in May 2022, they elected to run with 31-year-old Muyiwa Oki and kicked off a campaign hoping to elect the youngest, first black, first worker president in the RIBA's history. And this is chapter 2. Having set the scene, the events and ideas in chapter 2 will be structured around these 3 main themes. Climate literacy, so what this means for architectural practice and education, just transitions and the ethical implications of change in the profession, and then expanding into the question of tomorrow's architects, which is what the UK Architects Registration Board called its review of learning frameworks and education pathways. But it also draws consideration of who tomorrow's architects will be and the indicators of practice and what that will look like in the future. Climate literacy as a concept took off in architecture from 2020, so it's relatively new, and particularly through networks like ACAN and Architects Declare, and also adopted by the RIBA as a mandatory competency area. But climate literacy is not a topic. It refers to a range of practices, skills, and knowledge required by architects to respond to climate change. And like many terms, it's not perfect. It evolved organically through common usage and mainly in professional circles. I find the term climate literacy useful because it establishes climate change as a sustainability lens and not just a subject or topic area. It is about how architects interpret climate-related issues and form design responses. It suggests a way of acting rather than just knowing, like reading and writing. What it is not a new subject to be added to the curriculum. It's a holistic lens that connects topics that we're already covering in architecture education. It's not a technology topic. Climate literacy calls for integrated learning, cross-cutting and connected ideas across history, theory, design, technology. It's not a specialist area. Rather, it's about core values in line with professional ethics and code of conduct. If climate literacy is approached as a sustainability lens and not a topic area, it changes how we frame architecture education. This goes beyond curriculum review and the development of new learning content and calls for new pedagogies. Climate change is not just changing what is taught, but how. And in this sense, climate literacy calls for a transformed culture, how architecture is taught and how it's practiced, so that our students can see why architecture will still matter in 20, 50, 100 years. These transformative ideas are reinforced by academics in architecture who are also researching climate change education. For example, Arc for Change is a climate emergency curriculum that's described as fit for the 21st century. It's holistic. It's centered around 10 climate emergency design themes. It supports integrated learning through a teacher training toolkit with over 100 short videos, key readings, and case studies. It's values-led, positioning restorative and inclusive design and climate justice at its heart. Underpinning its aim is to enable radical transformation towards a carbon neutral society. And it also introduces new pedagogies through a teacher training toolkit. These ideas were present in the climate action movement right from the start. In July and August 2020, in the height of the COVID lockdowns, some of the most experienced educators across Europe participated in 2 online ACAN educators workshops, and the material was then compiled to form an education toolkit, and only a few of the principles and actions related specifically to curriculum knowledge. Again, it was holistic, identifying key curriculum points and a strategic approach. It was calling for an integrated approach, which they called warp and weft delivery, weaving terms, cross-cutting the curriculum. It was about reflection and collaboration between students and academics across subject areas and values-based cultural shifts. Again, it was also about new pedagogies to upskill tutors, to support student agency, and to lead by practice. The need to upskill educators in new pedagogies was also strongly reflected in the Building Change project, in which 3.9 million euros, which is over 6 million Australian dollars, was given through a very clever funding application led by TU Dublin, through which the Irish government invested in a process to build human capital, and not just the development of learning frameworks and new curriculum content. A large majority of the funds were spent on buying out teaching time to enable staff to participate in professional development. This focus on upskilling cross-cut all 6 schools of architecture who have undergone a co-review of their programs in line with new competencies for climate and sustainability. Again, it's integrated through a common design studio with modules and briefs that are shared between schools, as a primary site for ongoing innovation and external partnerships. It's values-based and it's focused on new pedagogies and upskilling educators. So what had started as a youth-led climate action movement through school strikes had taken hold among university tutors, graduates, educators, and students. There was a sustained focus on education reform, which was reinforced by those in power. The RIBA Journal had awarded Scott Macaulay of the Anthropocene Architecture School a Rising Star Award. The RIBA's new climate literacy knowledge schedule was a mandatory part of their education and professional development framework. They'd engaged in this joint mapping of climate literacy and architecture schools across the UK, and the Built for the Environment report and practice guide was developed in collaboration with Architects Declare. So by the time the Future Architects Front formed in early 2021, a generation of students and graduates were empowered by strong support for climate action, and they were more connected online than ever before due to the COVID lockdowns. Through ACAN and other groups, they were sensitised to the interconnected nature of unsustainable practice, and the ethics of architectural practice was expanding to connect with the idea of climate justice. It was in this context of formal surveys, curriculum reviews, and the development of new climate literacy learning frameworks that students began to question the culture of exploitation in practice. The commonly held expectation of free overtime, poor workplace conditions, as they completed their training towards professional registration was seen to be unfair. The letter that they put forward was signed by over 1,800 people in less than 4 weeks, and included an appendix with 100 quotes of personal accounts of worker exploitation in architectural practice. The rise of the Future Architects Front and its open letter to the RIBA was covered in Chapter 1, but I do want to elaborate on how this connects to climate literacy. How it started is that change is due, change is here. As the RIBA released its new education and professional development framework, it validated that the built environment has an urgent role to play in responding to the climate emergency. They said that this change was supported by growing bodies of evidence, literature, and commentary, which must be animated, as in put in action in universities and by extension the profession. As part of the climate literacy knowledge framework, it was introduced in line with approaches seen from Arc for Change, the ACAN climate curriculum, and in the Building Change project. The schedule included human factors of health and well-being, communities, interconnectivity and inclusion, and also social value. So in this way, the RIBA was reinforcing a holistic, integrated and values-led approach to climate action. Beyond climate literacy, the way ahead also placed a greater emphasis on the ethical role of the architect, including health and life safety as a result of the Grenfell Tower fire and the anticipated improvements to building safety standards. It placed a new emphasis on those areas of expertise and experience that impact on the quality and performance of the built environment and the health and well-being of those who use buildings and spaces, as well as wider duties to society and the natural environment. But for the next generation of architects, it seemed that these ethical considerations were being applied to architecture and the built environment, but not to architectural practice itself. Having issued its open letter on workers' rights, the FAF began to question the messaging that was coming from the RIBA. For example, this statement from the president at the time, Alan Jones, who appeared to be reeling back the ambition of the way ahead, stating that the RIBA education framework does not represent a fundamental change of direction, but rather builds upon the excellence of RIBA-validated architectural education. While waiting on a response to their open letter from the RIBA, the FAF continued to rally online attention through Instagram posts and memes. At the time, Instagram was a platform mainly for millennials, with limited engagement from the likes of RIBA presidents and practice directors, which meant that it served as a partially obscured messaging source to a target audience, architecture students and graduate workers. The Future Architects Front quickly established itself as a voice of the disenfranchised architectural worker. It saw itself as one with teeth, and the issues that many early career professionals cared about, like radical climate action, tackling employment standards, and reforming the profession, they wanted to see this being addressed by the Institute. The FAF was connecting climate action, climate justice, and workers' rights, and in the process aligning with the international Just Transitions movement. The Just Transitions movement is defined by the International Labour Organization as greening the economy in a way that's fair and as inclusive as possible to everybody, workers, enterprises, and communities. It's about creating decent work opportunities, ensuring social inclusion, and eradicating poverty. It involves maximising the socioeconomic opportunities of environmental action while minimising challenges through social dialogue. And this concept emerged out of labour movements, particularly trade unions, who were concerned that decarbonisation could produce job losses, regional economic decline, inequality, and social dislocation. At the same time, evolving at the same time since October 29, the UK section of the Architectural Workers Union was formed. And by 2021, they were also putting pressure on the RIBA. The memes that the FAF were generating had a consistent message that young workers were being exploited in order to become registered as architects, And by building on the points that they'd laid out in their open letter, a second youth-led movement was growing, and it was one that was demanding cultural change to the profession and an end to unpaid overtime. The group wanted to see oversight of the architectural assistant role by the RIBA. Graduates were reporting problematic access to the entry-level jobs that were required to train for registration, and firms were requiring more experience than could be expected from a university graduate. They were also highlighting a growing generational divide and a lack of representation in the governing body, the RIBA. But during a series of formal meetings with the RIBA, the Future Architects Front were unsatisfied with how their demands were taken forward. Disillusioned, they set up an informal WhatsApp group in which early career architects discussed how to accelerate the pace of change. Where climate strikes had resulted in collective action and a strong sense of solidarity, the call to address workers' rights in the profession seemed to amplify existing political tensions. The impact of Brexit on the British economy overlapped with COVID lockdowns and the Russia-Ukraine war, and it placed enormous pressure on the construction sector and, in turn, architectural practices. The world faced the worst recession since the Great Depression as a result of COVID, and in turn, the impact of Brexit on the economy was reported to be worse than that. There was a widely documented brain drain in the UK as companies relocated to the EU countries, along with EU citizens who could no longer have an automatic right to live and work in the UK. And it was the under 35s who were bearing the brunt of the job losses. Practice directors had seen an exodus of talent and investors. Many had managed staff furloughs during COVID lockdowns, and now there was the threat of a recession and forced to lay off of workers. So combined with the impact of Brexit, the UK economy was suffering more than other countries. An inflation shock coming out of COVID resulted in a rapid cycle of very low interest rates, followed by the steepest sustained increases in decades. And supply chain issues were driving up product prices and energy prices, causing a cost of living crisis. All of this was restricting lenders, delaying construction, and stalling investment. Developers were spooked by rising material costs, but they were also pressured by emerging policy changes. Building projects were being hit by a lack of supplies and price rises, but also the inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fires showed the need for substantial reform to safety standards. A new Building Safety Act received royal assent in 2022, and it required that residential buildings over 7 stories be classified as higher risk. So this drove up construction costs, and the need for fire escape stairs and refuge spaces impacted planning efficiency, apartment layouts, and saleable areas. At the time, developers were also rattled by the Retrofit First campaign, which was lobbying to reduce carbon emissions by preventing demolition. The Marks and Spencer Oxford Street case became one of the most prominent Retrofit First versus demolition debates in the UK, and the case became symbolic of the embodied carbon debate in architecture. So amidst these cost of living pressures, job loss, and an economic downturn, social justice agenda grew. The United Nations and the new European Bauhaus Collective had formed as an initiative of the Architects' Council of Europe. As a response to the European Green Deal, and 100 years after the formation of the Bauhaus, the NEB called for the EU to rethink their lifestyles and shape future ways of living around accessibility, inclusion, and sustainability. In November 2021, Architects Declare added a 12th principle, climate justice, through the launch of its practice guide. And in April 2022, the RIBA joined with 5 built environment professional bodies to sign an MOU on diversity, equity, and inclusion improvements. But in the 12 months since its open letter to the RIBA, the FAF remained disillusioned. In a journal article published by core members of the group, the campaign strategy is fully outlined. It states, We had all worked to change individual elements of the Institute and realised that the traditional industry lobbying approach had failed, and instead viable alternatives existed via the grassroots. They identified the work of ACAN and the Union Section of Architectural Workers, SAW, as critical to any future policies of a reformed institute. They also launched an open and vocal campaign led by a wide collective of early career architects and built environment professionals, which contrasted with the traditional behind the scenes machinations of an established architectural elite. Utilising Instagram's potential for dynamic, responsive media, wide-ranging critique was deployed via memes, data analysis, long-form writing, and an emergent peer-to-peer learning in the form of open polls, discussion, and informal sessions for students, graduates, and workers. As a 5-part masterclass series took off between the RIBA, ACAN, and Architects Declare, so did the RIBA presidential campaigns. So in June 2022, 3 RIBA hustings, which are staged presidential debates, were held between the 3 presidential candidates online, and voting opened for 4 weeks. Sumita Singh's campaign strength was her long track record of experience and commitment to diversity, headlined in an interview that she had the experience to change the RIBA. Her campaign reflected a commitment to challenge old colonial ways of thinking and to show how diversity and inclusion are key to building creativity and fairness in the profession. The message of Bacon's campaign was one of economic pragmatism, and as highlighted in an interview, she wasn't going to give promises that were unrealistic. As a managing partner, she had worked at the RIBA as a counsellor, and she convincingly positioned her business smarts and commitment to ensuring the RIBA continued to address financial issues. In her campaign, she stated, "Now's not the time to flip-flop about with changes of direction. We need to keep going with the very good stuff that's happening, and it's essential to the life of the RIBA as a sustainable institute." The strength of Oakey's campaign lay in his ability to engage his constituency and the strong lobbying base he had in the FAF. His promotion of more flexible routes into the profession aligned with what was being proposed through the ARB's review, and in seeking to redirect the profession away from starchitects, he captured the imagination of the next generation. In his campaign, he said that he wanted to speak up for the future of architects and to steward bold institutional reform, to galvanise the architectural profession and incorporate the energy and voice of unrepresented members. The profession is currently in service to the wealthy, the privileged, and the well-connected. Also in June, and before the official hustings, the UK section of architectural workers held a town hall, which included a series of panels and presentations. What this event did is it united many of the constituents who were most likely to vote for Oakey. They focused on unpaid overtime, wage transparency, exploitation and overwork, and barriers to access in the profession. At the end of the 4-week voting period in August 2022, it was announced that Oakey had won the election. Later, organisers reflected that in addition to the power of grassroots organising, digital literacy provided a generational advantage in this campaign. The independent hustings that they'd organised were accessible, functional, and programmed smoothly, and they reinforced the messaging across multiple social media platforms. The Guardian reported, "Elderly white men in bow ties have tended to run the very grand and possibly even stuffy Royal Institute of British Architects. Muyiwa Oakey, its youngest boss ever at 31, spells out his vision for unions, the climate crisis, and island-buying oligarchs." The group celebrated the identity of a worker president, the only worker, meaning an employee without the power to hire or fire, to ever be in this position. And if you want to learn more about this account, it's fully published in an open access journal article, which is linked here. In the year between Oakey's successful election and his commencing his presidency, they formed the Just Transition Lobby and also later mobilised to get more people on the Reba Council who brought young, diverse voices. I'm going to talk now about tomorrow's architects and close off the lessons learned for Australia. So, paralleling youth-led challenges to the establishment via Reba, future pressures, there were also pressures building around the Architects Registration Board. The outcome of a 2-year review process was culminating. They released a report in February 2021, which had 3 core research questions. What competencies do 21st century architects require? How should those competencies be obtained and demonstrated? And how should competencies be maintained throughout a career? It found that the architect's role was changing, that the traditional master builder generalist role had fragmented, and that architects were increasingly working in multidisciplinary teams, in specialist roles, under complex procurement systems, and with reduced control over whole projects. They were finding that sustainability and climate change was a core competency and fundamental rather than optional specialist knowledge. Later, they released a discussion document emphasizing that education and practice were misaligned, highlighting that there was tension between academic architectural education and practical professional realities, and that employers and practitioners were often arguing that graduates lacked sufficient expertise. The report provided further evidence of a generational divide that was forming. 62% of students agreed that an outcomes-based approach and flexible pathway would help to achieve the vision of a more modern education, where in contrast, 66% of academics and architectural academics disagreed. 94% of students agreed that the structure of education and training needed to change, but only 55% of architects did. In its final analysis, accessibility and diversity barriers remained a significant issue. Costs to education, unpaid labour culture, limited access routes, and socioeconomic exclusivity. Respondents also raised concerns about working conditions, mistreatment, and that the current system disproportionately affects or counts against women, transgender or non-binary people, people from a minority ethnic group, or people from a lower socioeconomic background. And in September 2022, they held an education symposium, which was attended by over 60 educators and architects, and opened a consultation period. What this consultation period revealed was a desire for diverse pathways into the profession, so flexible routes to registration, a conceptual shift from architecture as a primarily artistic authorship and towards a regulated professional competence within a complex system, and also diverse pathways out, recognising specialisms. So in May 2023, when the architects' consultation period closed, the new frameworks were released, and it was the most significant reform to education and training in the UK over 50 years. It was in this precise moment that I commenced my Churchill Fellowship, completely unaware of the political turbulence that I was about to enter into. In August 2023, I kicked off my trip by attending the Arc for Change curriculum launch event in Helsinki. They welcomed me and included me at their team celebration dinner, which was such a generous gesture. And one of the things about climate action spaces is that they tend to involve people who genuinely want the best outcomes. They share information freely and they rarely see an advantage in competitive behaviour. I also met with academics who had come across from Ireland, who'd led the teacher training toolkit component of that program, and was able to reconnect with them at the end of my trip. While in London, on Monday morning in September, I was sitting on this couch to the right in the RIBA foyer at Portland Place in London. I was waiting for a 10 a.m. meeting with Dr. Jenny Russell, who's the Director of Education and Learning. And sitting opposite me was a young black man, legs crossed, waiting, white sneaker bouncing. I looked up, I looked back to my notebook, I looked back up again and I thought, this guy looks familiar. And then I realized it was Muyiwa Oki sitting opposite me. And as it turns out, he was there waiting on the first day of his presidency for a meeting. I didn't want to distract him, but it was purely opportunistic that I could get an interview with him at a little later date because at the time I hadn't connected the dots between climate action, the Future Architects Front, and his presidency. There we go. So, given the recent close of the ARB's consultation period for tomorrow's architects, most of the people I spoke with seemed to be in a kind of exhausted lull. They were talked out after what was described as furious agreement that things needed to change, but heated debate as to how. Some were frustrated that the ARB hadn't included more explicit reference to climate literacy in their proposed changes, and they felt that the regulator was out of step with current progress in the profession. Others saw that the job of the regulator was to get out of the way of development and that it was best to avoid imposing aspirational mandatory standards on architects, especially if this exceeded what the rest of the construction industry was required to do. The RIBA was working to ensure that the impact of change on universities was managed, but the SCOSA, the COSA, the Standing Conference of Heads of Schools of Architecture, had been actively engaged through the ARB review. Members of the FAF and unionists with an interest in workers' rights seemed to have no issue with the ARB's proposed changes, seeing that the inclusion of more diverse voices would strengthen the profession as a whole. So at the end of my trip, this was released. Much of the research was just about paying attention. I couldn't help reflecting on the broader cultural conditions beyond the profession and how these were impacting events. London, as a proud and historic city with deeply established political structures, was teeming with tourists as always, but the cracks were showing in big and small ways. The photo on the right is of a mannequin in the window of a dispensing pharmacy in a very affluent part of London. It's wearing a range of supports, bandages, compression bands, and strapping products. In the window is also some classic British satire, a sign, middle-class man in a democratic society. The deteriorating state of the National Health Service in the UK was widely documented, but there was also a general state of disillusionment regarding politics in general. Each morning getting ready, I turned on the morning news, which I always do when travelling because it gives me an insight into what's going on, and also the tone of the reporting. And what I was hearing in the voices of the news reporters was a kind of astonished concern. Keep calm and carry on while being unable to believe that all this was actually happening. A new era had commenced for Britain, which was more than just symbolically reflected in the first anniversary of the death of their longest reigning monarch. These were all headlines in the 1 month that I was in London. 1 in 50 people were homeless, and you could see them everywhere. My Airbnb had an energy meter which showed me in pounds the amount of electricity I'd consumed. The school year was delayed because of a whole lot of poor quality concrete constructions and collapse risk. There was sewage spills and pollution concerns. And while I was interviewing people about climate change and climate action, their Prime Minister was reeling back sustainability commitments. And I could feel it. At the time of these interviews, everything felt politically charged. So, to encourage freedom of speech and confidentiality, I didn't record the interviews, and I promised that I wouldn't quote anybody directly as well. So the only quotes that are included in the report or in this talk are quotes that you can find in the public domain. So just to summarize, in Helsinki, I spoke with academics from all over the world who were interested in climate change education, and these people were motivated to press against resistance and persevere to improve curricula. But there was this consistent sense that they were sidelined and that academics without institutional or funding support in their workplaces were struggling to gain ground. In the UK, many of the people had been part of the first wave of climate action and they were moving into sustainability focused roles in practice, but they were burned out. There was a strong sense of burnout or imminent burnout in many of the people I spoke with. In Ireland, a generous amount of government funding had enabled them to focus on building human capital in support of collaborative approaches. So while I did observe a lot of challenges in the profession, I saw generational divide, political divide, disciplinary divide, there was also a lot of hope. As I drew together the findings, I saw that there was immense education reform that had occurred. There were these new learning frameworks and new studio models and live projects and practice collaboration through projects. There was collective action that was both top down with the support from high power stakeholders, but also cross-cutting across the profession. And there was also cultural transformation, diversity in the profession growing, and new pathways into it. And these are the structures that I tried to emphasize in the report recommendations. So while this story is focused on events in the profession on the other side of the world, I do need to connect it back to the Australian architectural profession. So I've outlined how climate literacy is becoming a core competency in architectural education and practice, and that internationally this led to significant education reform in the places that I visited. But in Australia, I worry that we're overlooking the importance of getting education right in architecture, that we assume curriculum progress will just happen alongside accelerated changes in industry. Internationally, public funding, institutional support, and industry engagement have been essential for schools of architecture to embed climate literacy across their curriculum and to train educators. And without these supports, efforts remain superficial and they're limited to optional or add-on subjects. We should be appealing to state and federal governments for funding to support this, but our current research funding mechanisms prohibit education research because this is seen to be an institutional responsibility. Education reform in architecture is about more than university degrees. As a regulated profession with ongoing education requirements, the challenge of building climate literacy extends to practice and through CPD education. So climate change calls for joint efforts between schools and industry. As climate literacy matured and incorporated climate justice and the just transitions movement, this led to coordinated collective action. A focus on education reform expanded to include workers' rights and training, and internationally, this action has been strengthened through sustained collaboration among diverse volunteer groups, industry organisations, professional bodies, and academic institutions. In Australia, we need to intentionally and strategically invest in the next generation of architects. One of the issues in the UK was the fact that future architects were struggling to engage with the RIBA. The Australian Institute of Architects has an established and relatively autonomous student organised network of architects, and Imagine, the Emerging Architects and Graduate Network, who have representation on National Council. Collective endorsement from influential people matters. Organisations can provide grassroots initiatives with the validation needed to recognise their own agency. Internationally, architects involved in climate action are burning out from the extra commitment of voluntary initiatives and resistance to change at work. The architectural profession has benefited from the collective efforts of these people and of voluntary climate action, campaigning and lobbying. However, those pressing for change in workplaces frequently encounter resistance and hostility, which is negatively impacting emerging architects and has caused this generational divide in the UK. We can avoid that here because climate action in benefit to the profession should not be free work. The idea of tomorrow's architects was a source of tension and heated debate. This youth-led protest movement had mounted, and the ARB embarked on a review titled Tomorrow's Architects. Internationally, architects have been protesting the cultural barriers that prevent change in the profession and demanding structural reform to education and practice. They built local networks and communities of practice. They generated a sense of agency, community, and solidarity through climate action. But in Australia, these connections have been more difficult to establish. My view is that that's partly due to the tyranny of distance that separates our cities. and also the fact that we overlook our many regional areas. I could see that the architects in the countries that I'd visited were benefiting from close proximity to major cities. They had easy access to an extensive transport infrastructure. They had larger numbers of people practicing in similar climatic conditions. They were using similar construction methods and accessing the same material supply chains. Whereas Australian architects are scattered across vast distances and varied climate zones. Australian architects belong to a small profession with approximately 17,000 people dispersed nationally across a landmass the size of continental Europe. We badly need to strengthen place-based connections and to recognise that there are cultural differences across our states and territories that need to be better understood and celebrated, while also building connections across the profession and progress towards nationally coordinated strategies. To do this, architects in a changing climate need strong connections between practices, universities, grassroots movements, and professional bodies. So, in wrapping up, during my travels, I learned that climate action gains momentum when architects connect their efforts across sectors and scales. By building coordinated networks between industry bodies, local initiatives, and universities, they were able to translate isolated projects into a shared national agenda. I may be biased, but I believe it is education that will turn climate action into professional leadership for architects. Overseas, dedicated funding and industry support have enabled architecture schools to embed climate literacy across their curricula, and it's preparing graduates for the transformative change to come. But the most important learning was that education alone cannot drive change without a professional culture to support it. The sustainability of climate action depends on this cultural transformation, valuing diverse roles, safeguarding well-being, and preventing burnout among those leading change. So that ends chapter 2, but the story doesn't end at chapter 2. It continues to unfold all around us into chapter 3, 4, 5, and beyond.
Great. Thanks so much, Liz. Now, I'm hoping there will be some questions from the audience. So if you've got any questions, please pop them into the chat. But what I might do is I might start off with a question. I think you sort of explained quite well the I think how the REBA works and the election of their president, which is, as I understand what you've outlined, is directly elected. Do you think that's a model that should be taken up in Australia? Because at the moment, and I think we might even have a few presidents in the audience, ex-presidents, at the moment, I think the president of the Institute is elected by the National Council. Do you think it would ever be possible here for that to happen? And do you think that would help us build a different kind of culture around architecture?
Mm. I think it's really important to take these learnings from another place and not see direct comparisons as something that can be translated, because we are operating in a completely different context here with state and territory based legislation and different climate zones and different cultures across the country. So I'm not sure that we need to kind of do two things at once. We need to strengthen leadership at a state-based level. And that's where I guess the kind of member-based elections system works currently in the Institute, and move towards a coordinated strategy at a national level. I'm not sure that whether or not the national president is elected by members or by the National Council makes much difference, because the critical mass of the profession in Australia is heavily reliant on strengthened connections between stakeholders at a national level. So I think until we've got a really close working relationship between all the boards of architects at a national level, the AASA, the AACA, all of these national entities working together, what happens within the Institute is only ever going to be limited to whatever services the Australian Institute of Architects provide, which is currently an awards program and CPD. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's kind of a bit of a roundabout way of saying I don't know. But another
No,
point I'll
I
make,
think it answers the question. I think the
yeah,
point you make about direct
yeah, okay.
translation is a fair one.
But I
What were
think
you
we
going
need
to?
data as well. One of the things that really struck me was the rigor of the ARB's review process. And that new framework that they put out was based on 2 years of consultation and multiple
Mm,
reports and stages.
mm, mm,
So whatever big structural changes we do at a national scale need to be data led.
mm. Yeah, I would agree with that. So they consistently collect data over time and make it available